For centuries, science measured reality by looking at isolated objects, a single neuron, a single person, a single atom. But modern complexity science has revealed that structure emerges from interacting dynamic systems. Despite this shift, a gap remains in our scientific modeling. We lack a coherent conceptual architecture that unites the mechanics of atomic forces, biological needs, and civilizational structures into one continuous language. We can close this gap by mapping all cross-domain interactions as strain exchanges, forces of demand and expulsion operating within topological continuums. To understand the hidden architecture of human cognition, we first have to establish the universal mathematics of how any system balances its own instability. This requires a total reframing of our definitions. Communication functions as the active redistribution of imbalance between systems. Imagine this process occurring across a neutral spatial field, a mathematical environment that physically reacts to these shifting imbalances. Ultimately, we will apply this topological framework to the brain kinematics model, explaining the exact biological mechanics of cognitive entropy, such as dreams and mind-wandering. Whether we are mapping a neural network or a human society, reality is an evolving surface, constantly sculpted by continuous attempts to achieve balance. The foundation of this model relies on one axiom: a strain is any deviation from relative balance that requires redistribution, regulation, or discharge. There are two fundamental polarities of strain. First are demanding strains, inward-oriented deficiencies seeking fulfillment. Examples include hunger, attachment needs, or cognitive uncertainty. The second polarity is expelling strains, outward-oriented overloads seeking release, such as gradients, emotional discharge, or the act of teaching. Interaction initiates when an internal imbalance exceeds a tolerable threshold. The isolated node cannot regulate itself, so it seeks an external regulator. Real connection occurs when the outward pressure of one system matches the inward deficiency of another. You see this coupling everywhere. A teacher with a need to express an idea, an expelling strain, meets a student with a cognitive need for knowledge, a demanding strain. What we observe as interaction across physics, biology, and sociology is the mechanics of strain complementarity in action. Applying this to human relationships, a bond is defined as a persistent strain regulation pathway. This equation demonstrates how we can map the strength of these pathways mathematically. The numerator dictates that bond strength is proportional to the compatibility of their demanding and expelling strains. The entire system's efficiency is then divided by resistance. This represents structural conflict, ideological mismatch, or a breakdown in reciprocal exchange. Scaling this up to the societal level, we see that institutions exist because the sheer volume of strain management often exceeds individual capacity. Governments are macro architectures built to regulate collective security strain. Religions regulate existential uncertainty. Legal systems manage the friction of conflict. An isolated system is inherently unstable. To survive, systems must couple together to export entropy and distribute their systemic overloads. These successful strain exchanges warp the surrounding mathematical space, carving out what we call a continuum. The attractive pole forms when a strain exchange effectively reduces instability, generating a gravitational pole and increasing local regularity. Conversely, when exchanges increase instability or encounter high resistance, they form the repelling pole. The grid pushes back, creating sharp topological ridges, boundaries, and fragmentation between separated basins. Both extremes are fatal. Absolute attraction leads to a singularity-like collapse or all individuality dissolves. Absolute repelling leads to total systemic fragmentation. This interplay between integration and differentiation appears in the symmetry of yin-yang, the mechanics of order and chaos, and the biological drives of approach and avoidance. Functional reality requires continuous oscillation between these two poles. It cannot survive at a single extreme. We can pivot this macro-topological model inward and apply it directly to the paradox of human cognition through the brain kinematics model. In this framework, weakened cognition is a highly regularized, constrained strain flow. strict sensory inputs dictate exactly where neural activity can travel. This local order allows for efficient execution of task-oriented logic, coherent narratives, and a stable sense of identity. But a cognitive system locked purely in this regularized state inevitably degrades. The pathways become too deep. Thinking becomes rigid, repetitive, and loses its adaptability. Waking consciousness represents a massive accumulation of directed strain. Without relief, the rigid architecture will eventually face systemic failure. Sleep, dreaming, and casual thought facilitate the active, controlled relaxation of waking constraints. During sleep, executive filtering weakens. The deep, rigid valleys of the waking neural grid physically flatten out into broad, shallow basins. This allows for exploratory rippling. Neural strain drifts associatively, washing across separated boundaries and interacting with isolated memory nodes. This structured disorder aligns with historical interpretations of dreams as a mechanism for emotional recalibration and the redistribution of cognitive strain. In modern neuroscience, this exploratory phase is responsible for driving memory integration, enabling predictive updating, and clearing accumulated entropy. However, if this rippling loses all topological constraints while awake, the system descends into pathology, resulting in hallucination and a fragmentation of the self. The apparent noise of dreams and wandering thoughts is actually a vital, high-dimensional search mechanism required to maintain the system's flexibility. Inspiration emerges at the precise collision point between exploratory rippling and directed regularization. The process begins during low constraint states, when exploratory rippling bridges two highly remote semantic or emotional nodes that waking logic would never connect. Then comes the stabilization phase. An insight occurs when this random, distant connection suddenly locks in, carving a deep, permanent trench that creates a brand new balancing pathway. While this topological framework provides a powerful systems philosophy, we must note a scientific caveat. Physical thermodynamic entropy is not a perfectly identical equivalent to psychological disorder. Still, the complementary necessity holds true. Waking requires the entropy relief of sleep, and sleep requires the structured inputs of waking. At every scale, from single neurons to global civilizations, long-term survival is never achieved through permanent order. It is sustained by rhythmically oscillating between directed regularization and structured exploratory